Hi folks, Harry Frank from Red Giant here, and I'm really excited to be the first to show you what's new in Trapcode Form 2. There's a lot of new stuff to cover, so let's dive right in and start with one of the biggest new features in here. Now, to do this, let me back up and talk about Form 1. All of the amazing stuff you've seen done with Form 1, such as this work from Design Group Barbecue, all of this work has been done with two basic starting shapes. We call these the base forms. And these two shapes have been a box and a sphere. Now, this box can be made up of a grid of particles or strings of particles strung together. But basically, you've had a box and a sphere to work with. And people have done pretty well so far. However, Form 2 takes us to a whole new level. You'll see in the base form, we've now added a fourth option labeled OBJ model. Now, in short, what this does is allow you to import an OBJ model, which is a 3D model, and render particles along the surface of the model. Specifically, it renders particles at each vertex of the OBJ. Now, that either makes perfect sense or no sense whatsoever. So, just so we all understand, an OBJ is simply a text document. It is a list of points in 3D space. Those points in space are called vertex points. One point is a vertex. Several points are vertices. Vertices go together to form faces, and those faces form the surface of a 3D object. OBJ documents don't just contain the three-dimensional points of the vertices. They also store information about the angle of the vertices, the angles of the faces formed by the vertices, which is called the normal, as well as what's called UV map information, which relates to the surface of the OBJ. But we're getting a little ahead of ourselves. What you just want to worry about right now, if this is all new to you, is that each of these vertex points will render a particle by Trapcode form. So let me show you that right now. Earlier in this tutorial, I said that you can import an OBJ and use that with Form 2. What I mean by that is exactly that. You can go to File, Import, and use the standard After Effects import process to import an OBJ. This is because when you install Trapcode Form 2, there is a separate plugin installed that allows OBJ files to be read and imported into After Effects. Now, this is significant if you need multiple computers or render farms to look at an OBJ as a part of a project, or you need to be able to collect these. Having the OBJs in your project is absolutely vital. And this is what you can do. So let's drop this OBJ into a project, and what you'll see is that it renders a simple preview image, letting you know that this is an OBJ file, and you're going to use it with Trapcode form. We don't need that on, so let's just turn that off. Let's create a new solid for form, apply Trapcode form, go into my base form, select OBJ model, and in my OBJ settings, I will define the layer that I'd like to use as the 3D model. There we go. I'm going to size this up just a little bit, but by default, Form 2 will hold on to the original dimensions of the OBJ. So you won't have any squashing or stretching unless you specifically distort it using the X, Y, and Z dimensions here. Let me turn up the size of the particles so you can see this a little bit better. So if I create a camera and rotate around or orbit around, you'll see that we've got particles rendered along the surface of a buckyball array shape. This was simply created in a 3D program and exported as an OBJ, and this should be one of the shapes that you would find included with your version of Form 2. Now, if you're paying attention when I went to File, Import earlier, you might have noticed down here that there's an option to select OBJ files sequence. And this allows just that, a sequence of OBJ objects. So over time, your objects can change, and Form will render each OBJ in a sequence. Let me show you how this works. So I'll just import a basic set of OBJs where a sphere bounces and turns into boxes. So I've got my sequence option selected. I'll hit Open, and let me drop this into a new comp. I'll drop the OBJ sequence in, turn off the visibility, create a new solid for form, apply Trapcode form, and create a new camera. So I just need to select that OBJ by going to OBJ model in the base form settings, and then in the OBJ settings here, define that bounce to boxes OBJ sequence. Let me turn up the particle size. So if I play this back, you'll see that it advances frame by frame. I've not done anything other than import the OBJ sequence, and all it's doing is rendering a particle at each vertex point. I have playback control over the OBJ sequence in the OBJ settings here by controlling the speed, which defaults to 1 OBJ per frame, and there's also a manual offset control here. A couple things I didn't cover. The skip vertex function simply allows you to skip vertices in the rendering process. Mainly, I see this being used for very heavy OBJs where you'd like to lighten the rendering load on your computer. And there's also a manual refresh button right here if you've edited the OBJ and you'd like to force After Effects to reload the OBJ model. Next, I'd like to show you some cool new options that you've got with your basic sphere layered base form, as well as some cool new features brought over from Particular 2, including shading and particle orientation in 3 dimensions. And to do this, I'll set up a little globe animation here. So let me make a new comp here for our globe. Add solid for form and a new camera. So had all this OBJ excitement, let's actually use one of the older types, which is a sphere layered, and set this to 600 pixels in all dimensions with 1 sphere layer. We'll make a little bit of a global map just with the layered sphere, no OBJs. I'm going to import a map of the Earth that I use a lot. Not terribly accurate, but it'll serve our purposes just fine right here. So let me drop this into our composition. You can see what it looks like. Like I said, it's not very accurate. In fact, it's missing a whole continent, but we'll just have to overlook that. In form, I'm going to go down to the layer maps and grab the Earth map and map its alpha channel to the alpha channel of the sphere. Why is that significant? Well, you couldn't actually do that before. Form 1 was lacking the ability to use layer maps in conjunction with base form spheres. It just couldn't do it. It was kind of a bummer, but now you can actually map and wrap stuff along the sphere, and I think that's really cool. In fact, if you want this to represent the oceans instead of the continents, you can click invert. There you go. You've got just the oceans. Now, one thing you're probably noticing is that because the particles are of equal intensity on the front and the back, it is a little bit hard to tell what's going on, especially if I turn up the particle size a little bit. So what we can rely on is a new feature brought into Form 2, which is a whole shading section. If you've used Particular 2, you're very familiar with these controls. This first one here, shading, allows us to have particles react to lights in After Effects. Now, let me put a couple lights in here and get them positioned first. And actually, to position these, I can use one more new feature, which is the orthogonal views, and we can have Form actually render in all the different views. It's really handy for positioning lights. So I'll set up light over here on one side and duplicate it, move another light over on this side. Jump to our single view, go into Form, and turn on shading. So the front's illuminated by the lights and the back is a little bit darker. So next, I'd like to contrast with this with what you can do with an OBJ spherical shape versus the base form sphere. So I'm going to duplicate this, and I'll call this form OBJ. I'm going to import sphere OBJ that I've got, drop this into my comp, turn it off. And in my form controls, let me set this to the OBJ model, and in the OBJ settings, I'll set this to the sphere. In general, it's pretty much going to look the same. In fact, it's going to lack the ability for me to subdivide it because it's only applying particles to each vertex point. And that's important to remember. Form doesn't do any subdividing for you. If you want more detail, you got to go into your 3D app and subdivide the surfaces even more. But there are some cool things that you can do with OBJs that you cannot do with basic shapes. And that is use the additional data, such as that normal information that I mentioned. So we have the angle of each vertex point stored in the OBJ, as long as it's actually there. It's not always there. In fact, by default, programs like Cinema 4D do not include the normal information. You have to use a third-party plugin called Riptide Pro to get that to work. But if it's there, you can use it in Form 2. So what I'm going to do is orient my particles along the surface of this OBJ. So first, let me create the custom particle. 20 by 20 is just fine, and I'll draw a little bit of a hex shape here. Okay. Let's drop this in the comp. Turn that off, form, and set my particle type to textured polygon. Remember, just like in Trapcode Particular 2, sprites are two-dimensional images that always face the camera, and textured polygons are two-dimensional images that are free to orient themselves in all three axes. So if I set this to textured polygon and define the texture as the custom particle, let me turn the size up. You can see that our particles are now orienting along the surface of the OBJ, which I think is pretty cool. Let me turn the size down, let's say to 5 for now. So looks like we've got some fixing to do here. First, let's just define some different color here. Now, textured polygon cannot have any color because it's grabbing the original textured polygon source image. Textured polygon colorize allows us to shift the hue of that custom particle around, so I can set this to whatever color I'd like, and I'll mix that color in. Let me go to my oceans here and set those to blue. There we go. So what we should be seeing is the oceans in blue, and I need to check invert on that, and the continents should be lining right up. And what I found is different programs seem to work differently, and Cinema 4D seems to be 90 degrees off from where Trapcode Form wants to call the starting point of this sphere. So if we go into World Transform and go into the Y rotation, if I simply dial in 90 degrees, then this will align the two objects up. This blue is kind of ugly that I chose. Let me darken that just a little bit. There we go. Now let me show you one trick that I did in that original. If I call this form obj1 and take the size down to 4, you can actually create a little bit of an offset pattern here. So if I duplicate this, call this form obj2, and in this obj2, go to the world transform and simply manually offset these from each other and create an interesting offset pattern, just like that. So those are the new shading options, new options with spheres that you've got, and there's still plenty to cover, so let's keep going on this. One thing you've probably seen a lot of with Form is this sort of effect right here, where we have text that perhaps dissolves to particles or forms from particles. Form is really good at this, but setting this up was a little bit complicated. More or less, what it boils down to is that you have to set up an external composition that is nested inside your main comp, and you have to kind of bounce back and forth between two compositions. In the end, generally, what you're doing is animating a simple gradient. Now, that shouldn't be too complicated. And in fact, in our quick maps in Form 1, you had the ability to more or less draw the representation of a gradient. You can think of this sort of as a white to black gradient. And if we could animate this up and down or offset this black and white, sort of like animate a brightness control of this map over time, we'd be able to do this just using quick maps without using external layers. And now we have that. We have a map offset control in here that I can animate over time. Now, let me show you exactly what this thing is doing and get rid of my keyframes here. So what I've got right now is a bunch of particles that are being affected by a fractal field displacement. So I'm having the particles be displaced as much as 200 pixels in either direction based on a calculated fractal field or a fractal noise map. But what I've got is in my quick maps, I have a map that has more value on one side and less value on the other mapped over the x-axis. So therefore, as you can see, I've got more of the fractal field displacement on one side and less on the other. If I were to show this with disperse strength, in fact, let me zero out fractal field displacement. If I set this to 100, we have more disperse on one side and less on the other. It's not going to the edge of the text. It's actually going from one edge of the comp to the other. So that's what these quick maps do. And now we can animate them. So at a default value of 100, the map looks like this. If I were to animate it down to 0, if I have a map that looks like this and I were to animate all the way down to 0, the map basically is moving downward, and that maximum value that it can apply right here becomes less and less, as well as the other side becomes less and less. So basically, as it goes down to 0, we end up with no effect of that parameter. And back above 100, we can actually push it upward and fill the whole screen with the effect. So you can think of it like this animating map, or think of it like a brightness control and a gradient. Either one, that's essentially what you're doing. It's a little bit complicated to describe. It's probably best just seen in action. So let's have some text form from sand. So let's say text from sand. And let's put some text in our composition. Let's have it say something really creative. And create our form layer. Add form. Not even going to bother with a camera because it really doesn't matter here. Now, the way I generally do this is to go into my base form and have my form shape mimic the size of the composition. So it's 1280 by 720 by 1, filled with 1280 by 720 particles by 1 in Z. This way I know that if I'm using text, the text is not going to be distorted. I have a one-to-one representation of what's going on in my comp. So if I go to my layer maps, I can set this to use that text layer and grab the RGB and alpha channel of that text. And I have to do one more thing, which is tell it which two axes to map this layer. Trapcode form is a three-dimensional particle system, and this is a flat two-dimensional layer. So I need to pick two axes to map this. Now, the thing to remember with quick maps is that they are a throttle for other things that you've set. So if I set disperse values like this, and I disperse the particles in a random direction, or I displace the particles based on the fractal field, these things can be throttled by the quick maps. So I'm going to have it affect the fractal strength and the disperse strength. So I can sort of turn the disperse and fractal strength up and down from the quick map. I'll set these both to the x-axis, and in the map section here, I'll use the same map in them, which is this one right here. So got more fractal field and more disperse strength applied over on one side than the other. Now what I'm going to do, if I want this to dissolve from text, I want the maximum amount of effect from the beginning. I'll set these both to 200 and I'll animate these over time. I could set 2 keyframes. I found that just making an expression that has map 2 follow map 1 makes things a lot easier. So over time, I'll have map 1 animate from 200 to 0. So with 0, basically there is no effect of the fractal strength and no effect of the disperse strength. So over time, that map will move across the x-axis. Now, it's not going to be very exciting. I mean, it's kind of cool, but it's not really dissolving from anything. It just kind of sits there as a big blob and then comes in. We have to do one more thing, which is have the particles either fade or scale on. I tend to use scaling, so I'm going to map size over x. And in this particular effect, if we're going one way with the map to have the fractal strength come on, we want to go the opposite direction. So I'm going to use the same map and flip it using the flip button right there. And you'll want to animate the offset values in reverse. So if these go from 200 to 0, you'll want your size to go from 0 to 200. Do a quick preview of that. If you want it to go the other way, all we have to do is flip all 3 maps. Oops. One flip. There we go. On the surface, not a very exciting looking control, but I think this opens up a lot of possibilities in terms of easily controlling these values in varying degrees over different axes without the complication of having to set up additional compositions and bounce back and forth between 2 compositions. I think this is a really cool feature, and I'm really happy this is here. Now, there's still some more cool stuff to cover. I'm going to create another comp here, and let's just create a grid of square particles. So I'll go into Form, create a basic grid. So I want 1 particle in Z, maybe 500 by 500 by 1, and 20 by 20 should be fine. Let's turn up the size, create a custom particle. So I'll just use a square. So I'll go maybe 20 by 20, call this square, and turn that off. Go into Form, set the particle type to textured polygon colorize, and go to the texture and set this to square. There we go. So first let me label this comp as the form grid, and I'm going to create another comp, and this will be an animated map. This is like how we had to do things the old way before we could animate quick maps. But there's still some cool stuff that we can do with these layer maps. So I'll create a white solid and a black solid, and I'm going to throw a linear wipe from on 1 so that it animates from black to white. Go in here and add a little bit of feather. And drop this map into our form grid. Now in layer maps, you'll see another option in here, which is rotate. Now, before, in the past, you could do things like, well, we could crank up the disperse and disperse these in one direction. And then I can go into the disperse, select this map this over X and Y, and then have these dispersed like that. But as you've learned, we've got quick maps that we can do that kind of stuff with. One option that we've got in here that we don't have with quick maps is a rotation option, and this is new. In fact, let me zero out this disperse. So I can have that map control particle rotation in 3 dimensions. So let's say I set the layer for X to the map. I map this over X and Y, and I hit play. We're going to see this set of particles start to rotate in one direction. Now, if I get creative with this with a basic sphere OBJ, I can do the same thing and have 3-dimensional particles rotate along the surface of the OBJ. I think that is really cool there, and I think this opens up some really interesting possibilities for animators. One more interesting thing with layer maps is that if there is UV map information embedded in the OBJ, that is basically the starting point and ending point, the direction of the surface, sort of the surface flow. So if you think of XY coordinates to give something its position in space, UV coordinates move along the surface of an object. Those coordinates basically tell us how the surface flows, where the surface starts and where the surface ends. Layer maps, if that UV map is present, map along those UV maps. So if I go into the displacement here, and let's say I set this to individual XYZ and have Z map to that animated map. I'll see these if I rotate around. In fact, let me turn off shading to make this a little easier to see. We'll see the particles displace in the order that they're specified in the UV map. So they're not just going X or Y or Z, but they're going in the order that they're ordered along the surface, which is defined by the UV map. If you don't want this to happen with your layer maps, simply don't include the UV map and it won't do this. I think this is very interesting because it allows you to control directions that you would never be able to do in just using X, Y, or Z. Lastly, I'd like to show you something that's been bugging me for a long time, and I'm glad that's finally in here. So let me wrap up with one more example. First, let me set up an example using one of the new particle types. So if I go to base form, set this to box strings, I'll set this to 12 particles or 12 strings in Y and 1 string in Z. Let's stretch this out in X and Z. So we've got basically a series of particles strung end to end. One of my new particle types is the streaklet. So I can actually use a streaklet particle from particular 2, which if I turn the size up, it'll be a lot easier to see. More or less, it appears as if it is a series of streaks inside one particle type. Now, it doesn't look very impressive right now because I have to go in and squish them together a little bit more. The density defaults to a little bit of a lower value that streaklets don't seem to work very well with. But there. So now that we can see that they're strung together, I can go into my particle section, streaklets, and define the size of the streak, how many streaks I've got, and I can kind of randomize them if I'd like. So let's say I go in here and disperse and twist these a little bit. So one thing you've seen a lot with Trapcode form is this spherical field. It's a very cool thing where you can actually sort of push particles out of the way. So if I turn up this strength here, you see this circular area that particles will avoid. Or if I set it to a negative value, they'll actually be attracted to that. And we had a visualizer to show us what was going on with that. And we still have that, but it's a little bit different. Now, we have the 3 axes represented in red, green, and blue. And we have a lot more controls here. We actually have detailed control over its X, Y, and Z scale. So we can squash and stretch the scale of this independently. We also can rotate it. X, Y, and Z. Up until now, all you've had is a basic sphere. And to its point, it is called a spherical field, and a sphere is perfectly round. But now we can sort of distort this sphere and rotate it in different directions, and I think this is a really cool option to have, and I'm really happy to have this function in here. So let's perhaps add a little bit of color to this and turn off the visualize field. Go to fractal field, affect the displacement of these, and flow this along the X. Let's do a little less displacement. That's a fast flow. Let's turn that down.